Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Ambassador Philip Reeker, Chair of the Global Europe Program. At the Global Europe Program, we investigate European approaches to critical global issues, from digital transformation to the climate issue, migration, and global governance, including how we deal and embrace the issues involving the Global South. Our guest today is Dr. Nathalie Tocci, Director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, and an honorary professor at the University of Tübingen in Germany. A good friend of the Wilson Center, an expert, a widely published author. Nathalie, welcome. You come to Washington just days after the US-EU summit, when Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and EU Council President Charles Michel came to Washington and met with President Biden. How do you assess the US-EU dynamic? All of these issues in the world, how are the US and the EU working together to address them?
Well, firstly, thank you, Phil. It's a real pleasure to be here. I would say that the transatlantic relationship has actually, perhaps saying never been so strong, maybe a little bit too much, but certainly has not been this strong for decades. And this is not just, the years of the Trump administration. I would argue that it is now far stronger than it was during the Obama presidencies. Certainly the Bush presidencies. So we have never had it so good. It has gone through different phases. There was, as always the case, a sort of initial moment of honeymoon. We went through a few months of a slight rough patch over the Afghanistan withdrawal. But frankly speaking, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there has been incredible alignment across the Atlantic on a range of different issues. Starting with Ukraine, increasingly on China, now with war erupting once again in the Middle East, as well. More broadly, the question of how to engage with the Global South, having on both sides of the Atlantic, realized that we have a problem. We have a reputational problem. We have an action problem. So how are we going to address this together? So I think literally across the board, there is full alignment. I think the question now moving forward is how do we, I wouldn't say, there is a sort of Trump-proofing the transatlantic relationship, and that is and has its set of complexities. But I would say more broadly and in a more structural sense, how do we proof a transatlantic relationship for a United States that moving forward will and may well look less and less to Europe and its surrounding regions. So how do we, on the one hand, increase European responsibilities in our part of the world, and doing so in a way where that alignment across the Atlantic continues to be strong, but the overall balance will have to change. I think that we're getting this recipe. We're increasingly getting the recipe right when it comes to Ukraine, and not just Ukraine. I think there has been a growing European responsibility, be it in terms
taken on
of
more.
Absolutely, be it in terms of military support, economic support, reopening up the question of enlargement, refugees, energy. You look at it across different policy areas. So I would say almost top marks there. Certainly the direction of travel is the right one. I think that when it comes to the South, Europeans still have some questions to ask themselves. I think that when it comes to the South, starting with the Middle East, we have always played second fiddle to the United States. And in a sense, we have been rather lazy in not asking ourselves some of the tough questions in terms of what is it that we can do and what is it that we have and should be contributing.
I think President Biden came into office underscoring that with all of the problems in the world, and mind you, we were still in the midst of the COVID pandemic, the United States could not tackle these problems alone. It was an era when we needed our allies and our partners, and he set about to revitalize, repair, if that's the word that was necessary, relationships. One of the most important structures that he's focused on was the G7. Italy is going to take over in January the presidency of the G7 for 2024. What do you think will be Italy's priorities? How can Italy's leadership under Prime Minister Meloni at the G7 help us tackle these questions and perhaps bring some different perspectives?
Yeah. So indeed, I think that the G7 has been, over the last few years, certainly since 2021, really a main centre of multilateral decision-making in this fractured world that we live in. And I think the G7 has already been on a journey of trying to reach out, and hence we talk about a G7 plus. Now, so far, the G7 plus has been largely understood as plus a number of other partners and allies in Asia. And of course, that has to continue being the case. And the reason, obviously, why that was done was very much along the lines of thinking of the democracy-autocracy divide, but also how do you deal with China? And as I said, whereas that has to continue, that track of how you use the G7 has to continue to be part of the equation. But I think what Italy and the Italian presidency can add is how to add a second leg to the plus, to the interpretation of the plus, which is not necessarily that of working with other democracies, but rather using the G7 as a platform to engage the so-called global south. So what the Italian presidency is thinking about is how do you bring Africa, basically, into this conversation, Africa and the Middle East, thinking mainly of certainly was thinking of the Arab Gulf countries before the war erupted.
Gaza.
Let's see if now that interpretation actually widens to include other partners, obviously starting with Egypt. But essentially, I think that this is a story of, sort of how do you use a platform to address a problem that we both now acknowledge being a very urgent one, which is that of outreach, that has to do not just with words. Of course, words are important, but it has to do with real action. So how is it that the G7, for instance, can be used to drive forward the energy transition in Africa? Sort of over the last couple of years, and certainly since the energy crisis, as one of the first fallouts from the Ukraine war, at the moment, that has sadly, whereas it's been tackled extremely effectively in Europe in the sense that we have actually managed to wean ourselves off from Russian gas, but it has tragically actually fed into many of the sort of, views and prejudices of Europe and the West in the global South, because much like we were vaccine hoarding during the pandemic, we've now been accused of gas hoarding. So how do we move beyond that and use the G7 and the G7 plus outreaching to Africa in order to reverse that and actually put energy and funds into especially Africa's transition?
While also addressing the climate challenge and dealing with goals with renewables, the COP process, of which, of course, the Global South has to be an important part. We talk about the G7, and it's sometimes easy to forget that it wasn't that long ago, it was the G8. It included Russia. And Vladimir Putin sacrificed, forfeited that engagement with the other great powers because he invaded Ukraine at that time, Crimea, illegally annexing territory, violating all the fundamental principles of the United Nations and OSCE to which Russia had signed up. That's forgotten sometimes, and now we see, of course, Putin with President Xi of China at the anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. How do you think Europe and the United States together will deal with Russia, which is, after all, part of Europe, going forward in the future? How significant, as you see the EU-US summit in Washington, sort of side by side last week with Putin and Xi together in Beijing? How do you contrast those?
Well, I think at the moment, you can only contrast them by, on the one hand, working on your own strength and unity, and on the other hand, engaging the, let's call them the in-betweens, the multi-aligns. And you engage the multi-aligned not by forcing them to choose, but making them offers that are worth it for them. And this is where the earlier conversation about the G7 plus and Africa and the Middle East and all the rest of it comes in. I think when it comes, though, to what you do with really the other team, right?
Yeah.
I think on the one hand, one has to, especially on the Russia question, start off with an admission of impotence. We cannot change Russia.
And yet Russia has gone from being a member of the G8 to being the junior partner, very junior partner, in a relationship
Well, it's a
with
vassal
China.
state to all extents and purposes, right? But I think we have to acknowledge, and in fact, I would argue that it's extremely dangerous thinking to try and think what is it that we can do to positively influence Russia, because that automatically gets you in dangerous territory that we hear a lot, sadly, in Italy about forms of compromise. So I think we shouldn't go down that track. One should acknowledge, there are some things that we can do. We can help Ukraine win the war. We can bring enlargement back on the agenda. We have to do more to stabilize the Caucasus, and perhaps embrace Armenia if it were to be interested in actually joining the EU. So there are a number of things that we can do, and it's in our power to do them. There are some things that are not in our power to do. We don't know what's happening in the Russian black box, right? And we have no power over it. And in a sense, we have to live with the consequences of Russia as is. At the moment, the consequences of Russia as is rebuilding a security architecture which is not built with Russia, but it's built in protection against
the
Russia.
kinds of threats that Vladimir Putin is showing.
And I think that a number of institutions that have emerged over the last couple of years, such as, for instance, the European political community, where there are, sort of huge differences in terms of human rights and democracy and all the rest of it, and yet everyone around that table, from President Erdogan, sort of through to all EU member states, agree on one thing: sovereignty and territorial integrity are important principles.
The fundamental
And so
principle.
everyone, with the exception of Russia and Belarus, are part of that grouping.
And it's proving to be a useful grouping, I think.
Yes, I think the very fact that it is heads of state and government that want this grouping to live on really gives you a sense that they see value in it. It may not necessarily deliver huge policy results. I think, in order for policy to be delivered, you need institutions of a different kind, the one that sort of work on things day in, day out. However, to have moments in which heads of state and government meet every 6 months to discuss broad issues pertaining to European security has huge value at this point in time.
And it is that engagement that's based on geography. You can't change geography. These countries are going to be neighbors. They're going to share the same continent, the same challenges. And it is an opportunity for, in some ways, pure diplomacy, engagement at the highest level. I want to shift a little bit in our final moments here to ask your views, coming from Rome, very well connected in the world of geopolitics, how the U.S. is perceived in Europe broadly, not just the European Union, but this larger scale, as they watch the media, the reports of our own dysfunction, as some would say, the challenges in our Congress, the sharp political divides. Is this affecting how they view the United States overall and the partnership that we have across the Atlantic? And what do you see as the way forward for European perspectives in trying to help resolve some of these issues with the United States?
So I would say that what there isn't, and I don't sense at all, is something that used to be there actually in the past. So there were moments, let's take the first Bush administration. There were moments of very deep anti-Americanism in Europe. I don't see and I don't sense that anywhere. So there are no hard feelings, and this is largely because of the Biden administration. But there is a lot of concern. And how does that concern play out? What does that concern actually mean? And I would probably divide it into sort of three slightly separate boxes. Actually, I think that concern number one is precisely the democracy concern. Because, whereas, of course, democracies, these are all national stories to a large extent, there is a certain influence and kind of feedback loops. And nowhere is the strongest than between, what the model and the message coming from the United States, how this then plays out in Europe. Mm-hmm. It's no coincidence that the height of nationalist populism, both in the United States and in Europe, happened at the same time, exactly. Right? And so there is a very deep concern about the future of American democracy and what this means for European democracies. And that's one part of the conversation. Second part of the conversation is, and largely revolves around Ukraine. Massive concern that were there to be a change of administration in the United States, the US would drop the ball on Ukraine. And although what I was saying earlier is right, Europeans have been stepping up to the plate, but the truth is that if the United States were to drop the ball in a year and a half from now, we would not be ready to shoulder this completely on our own. And therefore the anxieties that generates in different European quarters, especially obviously in Eastern Europe, are huge. There are a number of conversations going on as we speak in Europe, and I'm part of several of them, of how to Trump-proof Europe. And what is it that we can be doing over the next 15 months in order to, sort of cater for that eventuality, which, sort of we made the mistake once already of completely ruling it out as a possibility.
Yeah. And it's an important reminder, though, that throughout all of these years, across administrations, the transatlantic bonds, some of them institutional through NATO, through the OSCE, continued to operate in spite of or despite politics both in the United States and in Europe broadly and in individual European countries. And do you feel that we still have the basis of our shared values, which have been so fundamentally important to U.S. foreign policy, to the global order, as we call it, certainly since World War II, to continue that leadership role in a world that is far more complex, where the global South has a much larger voice and a much larger number of people who are aware of what's going on, who are connected through the internet, the social media, their iPhones, in addressing these issues? Do you think that bond is still solid?
I actually think it is. And I think the fact that it is under threat and those values are under threat, have reawoken us up to the fact that actually these things, and therefore that relationship is hugely important. I think, though, at the same time, we both acknowledge the fact that the world is changing. And so in order for that partnership to remain relevant and tightly knit, what is it that we have to do? And I think there's an internal transatlantic story, which is one of the United States acknowledging that Europeans have to step up and Europeans stepping up. And we've known this for a while, but I think we're still at it and actually doing it. And it takes both sides to work on this, because it does mean that the mode in which we've been operating for decades has to change. I mean, let me just give a very sort of small example of this, which has to do with Iran. Europeans were instrumental in enabling the United States, once Iran and the United States were ready to move forward, to lead to the JCPOA. But the European role was always a function of facilitating a US role. And I think this is true almost across the board. I think we as Europeans still don't quite know what that rebalancing means. You know, how is it that you formulate an objective which is not simply about facilitating the US to do something, but it's actually doing something yourself, right? But at the same time, there also has to be work on the US side in accepting the fact that Europeans have to grow up in a sense, it's developing a strategic culture and figuring out what is it that they want, basically, in the world. So I think there's that internal story. But then we both have to figure out how is it to engage the multi-aligns, yeah? I mean, those that don't play either in one team or the other.
As they say, the new non-aligned movement
Exactly.
is back and a factor. But what underlies that is that the transatlantic relationship, the United States, of course, Canada as well, with our European partners, allies, not just the EU, but geographically, have this enormous responsibility based on our trade relationship, our history, our shared culture, values, indeed, our security partnerships. And that will continue to be a topic on which we have many more opportunities in the future to discuss. Nathalie Tocci, we want to thank you for joining us at the Wilson Center.
Thank
We
you.
look forward to welcoming you back. Thank you for being with us.